Okay, still very much in territory we really haven't received feedback for, so yeah, let me know what you think. Any really level of feedback is appreciated. Um, though I do prefer constructive to not constructive. Though that probably goes without saying. I'm just gonna start reading. Thanks. Make sure you're listening to these in order. I slowed as I reached the glade. The air is always a little cooler here, where the trees form a dense lattice of branches over the small clearing, and Bear Watch's creek pools out in cascades through a series of tiny basins and waterfalls. There are a couple of tables and several stone slab benches, and the ground here is covered in needles and leaves. This area is often used for meetings and picnics, but today I could hear them before I rounded the corner and the path dropped into the glade. Two voices. They sounded similar but not identical, like one person in two different moods, and neither was speaking Prosaeus or any of the half-dozen local languages that are still used in parts of Assoria, or any of the standard naming languages. One spoke slowly, and the other seemed to be interrupting her a lot. The first didn't particularly seem to care. I approached the strangers. The one that was speaking slowly was tall and slim, with raven dark hair and cloud-white skin. The other had the same face and the same build, but seemed sharper, somehow. She had rich brown hair with reddish highlights that hung in braids around her shoulders and olive skin. It was strange at first, seeing two people who were so clearly the same and yet so different. The strangers were so engrossed in their conversation that they didn't seem to notice me. I got closer, waved, got closer still, and still they talked on, near identical voices overlapping in a strange melody. I was about to try to step between them when there was a movement several feet away. Another young woman, the same as and as different as the first two, sat abruptly up out of a pile of leaves. I jumped, then watched her somewhat incredulously as she yawned, pulled a leaf or two out of her almost blood-red hair, put her index and middle fingers in her mouth, and whistled loudly. Not whispered, that's the opposite of what she did. Extremely loudly. I cringed and plugged my ears. The sound resonated through my skull, and I could hear nothing else for a good 3 seconds. The two women who had been talking continued to do so, apparently unfazed. I stared horrified at them for a moment, then turned and made a face that should have broken the language barrier at the young woman who had made the offending noise. She pointed at the sky and said something that, by her expression and demeanor, was clearly meant to be some sort of explanation. It was unintelligible. I nodded slowly, and she said something else and stared at me, inching closer as she did so as if I might lash out at her. I watched her watching me, trying to get a read on her. There was a strange moment where I felt myself being reflected back at myself, and I realized she was doing the same thing. She was surprised too, as she clearly had much the same realization, and we were both now staring harder when there was a flurry of movement from behind and above her. The fourth one. I would have wondered where she was before if I hadn't been so distracted. She descended from the sky rather rapidly. It seemed like more of a controlled fall than a landing, with a long staff in her hand. For some reason, I'd rather thought they would... I don't know what I thought. I didn't expect the flying to seem so much like floating. The woman looked exactly like her sisters. That is, she had the same face and structure as her sisters, but was as different in coloring and hair as what the others were from each other. They now all stood and faced me, the same eyes in 4 different colors, the same face in different seasons. One cool, calm, and grounded, one hawk-eyed and appraising, one unflinchingly focused on me, the one who had been staring at me before. She still had leaves in her hair, and one animated and distractible. Energetically, they all felt as they looked, the same but different. Not like quadruplets, but almost like different versions or different aspects of the same people. It was almost hard to tell them apart. I suddenly felt very strongly that I needed to talk to them, that this wasn't just a matter of figuring out why they were here, but potentially something much more important. I had a parallel strong urge to separate them and see how they acted independently. I put the second impulse away for the moment. At the same time, they seemed to have reached a sort of conclusion of their own and began all talking at me at once. I watched for a minute. When it became clear that their plan was definitely to keep talking at me until I understood, I dug a pad of paper and a pen out of a pocket and started drawing. All of them stopped talking and watched me draw. When I was done, I put the pad on the table and pushed it in front of them. "Where are you from?" I asked, gesturing at the rough map I'd drawn. They looked at it, puzzled, and looked back to me. The flighty one and the suspicious one exchanged a few words. "Okay?" I nodded. I rested my left hand lightly on the paper and closed my eyes, then whispered in Falar, my favorite of the common naming languages. "What I see, you know. What I say, you show. Where I point, image flows. Let this be a bridge of understanding." It was simple and not particularly elegant, but for light weaving, the words are more of a container than anything else. "This is Asoria," I said, pointing at Asoria on the map. I traced my fingers around the perimeter of the country and focused. "These are the walls of Asoria," I said. A mirage rose, a tiny shimmering wall standing out of the paper. The cities and mountains and lakes and farmland rushed inward from the walls to populate the country. One of the sisters clapped. I raised an eyebrow at her and moved on. "This is Tau. We are here." The city we now stood in enlarged on the map and became clearer. I briefly summoned up 5 tiny figures in a grove and let them pass. "These are the northern forests." A minute boreal forest cropped up on the map north of the wall. This time the flighty one squealed and pointed at a spot on the map east of Asoria. She made an odd motion with her fingers, and, strangely, some of the wall began to fade and flicker as if they were trying to become something else. There was a strange pinching feeling as she did so. Generally speaking, one can't interact directly with a light weave unless one is very familiar with its maker, and the sensation of a stranger doing so was odd. Her sisters seemed almost as surprised as I was. She made the same motion again, harder, and the walls flickered briefly into a great dark form east of Asoria, then popped back into walls again. Before she could try it again, I really didn't like the pinching sensation. I held up my hand in a motion to stop. She stared petulant at me and said something. I don't think it occurred to her that I could still feel the mirage I was holding. "Okay," I said. "I don't know if this'll work." I put 2 of my fingers on the map at the point where she had indicated and focused, but not on anything in particular. The point glowed slightly as I poured energy into it. I nodded at the girl to try again. She reached out to the point, and a place appeared that I mostly associated with books to frighten children. A great dark thicket of tangled trees with one huge and particularly gnarled-looking specimen in the center. The witch's swamp. "Is this where you're from?" I asked doubtfully. In response, she summoned up 4 little figures with staves ascending from the swamp and gracefully bounding across the great open space and over the walls of Asoria. I got the strong impression that the answer to this was no. This was where they had just come from. That was something, at least. I pictured the rest of the continent, as well as I knew it, and let the remaining landscape flow onto the paper. The eastern sea filled in with rippling blue water. I hoped it looked enough like the sea to get the point across. Never having seen the sea, I wasn't entirely sure what it looked like, and I had to approximate with the lake of deepest green. The great desert around our walls became a reddish sand. The nexus of the sentinels and the fairy woods populated with mixed forests. I swept my hand across the map and asked again, "Where are you from?" I concentrated on the meaning of the words and hoped that would be enough. For a moment, the sisters puzzled over the map. Well, that's there. Then the quiet one shook her head sadly. She motioned for me to hold my hand as I had done for the flighty one, and as I did so, she swept hers over the map. Half of the trees disappeared, replaced with agricultural land and factories, mines, and dirty, belching cities. The nexus of the sentinels was one of those cities. Another was the mouth of Hyrathor, the jewel of the eastern coast. I took it in, tried to take it in, and a heaviness settled into my chest as I looked upon the new face of the continents. Evidence of the passage of time and tyrants that Asoria has been thankfully immune to, or badly neglected, depending on the angle from which you view it. Tears welled up in my eyes. I could not see neglect. Yeah. Now she pointed at a spot not too far from the first city, and when our fingers came to rest there, a small house appeared. I gave the light weave more power and it grew. A house in a little clearing, surrounded by forest. There was a goat in the yard. They all stared at me now, and the one who had been guiding the mirages said one word. This was their home. There was a moment of almost reverent silence. Then the flighty one burst into chatter. After a moment, the suspicious one quieted her. I repeated the word the quiet one said, and said in prosaic, home. 3 of the 4 repeated, home. One word. It's a start. It's a good word to start with, home. It conveys a great deal of meaning. We'll stop there. Thanks for listening.